Welcome to the Mirror Media Podcast with Mukunda.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Mirror Media Podcast. Today we have another recurring guest, Dr. Raj Balkaran. We have met him, I think, probably 6 months ago or something like that.
January,
a year ago. Oh, almost a year ago. Wow, it shows you how bad I've been on the podcasting. But on the flip side, Dr. Balkaran has been like a champion. What is it like? You get through like 2 or 3 new podcasts every week on the history. The Indian religions podcast. You have new books in Indian religions.
I do somewhere between 4 to 8 a month, so 1 or 2 a week.
Yeah,
one or two books we cover a week,
which is crazy. And it just, I mean, that's a lot of reading aside from everything else you're doing. That's gotta like just take so much time.
Well, that's all I do, right? The podcast. There's not much else.
So, Dr. Balkaran, welcome back to the podcast. It's interesting because the way we not reconnected, but we could say that. Someone that was listening to my to Meru podcast, I think, reached out to you for some coaching and some just general spiritual guidance. And I've had a few people actually reach out to me before and say they reached out to you or they've listened to your podcast. And I do have to say there's a lot of podcasts out there that cover, not a lot, but a decent amount that cover like Indian mythology or Hinduism or Indic religions. But most of them, and I just being frank, I don't think most of them cut the
make the mark.
Make the mark, yeah, make the mark.
Because the expression you're about to say is probably not kosher.
That's right. So yeah, cut the mark, because I feel like a lot of them, they get very insulated in like a narrative that they're also trying to say, whether it's going to be like a more Indian Hindu based. Like when I mean Hindu based is really connecting the India side to Hindu side all the time, where everything is pure perfect and not complex or not complicated. It's like this golden age of India existed until roughly the Muslims came, and I think that and even today the reason that India and Hinduism isn't the way it should be is because of Western influence. Well, I think like the podcast you provide gives the listener a real strong gamut of like both the very critical like thinkers who are maybe not practitioners, but they're critical, like really critical towards the tradition, which, some people can be upset with or not want to deal with, but you have to deal with it. I mean, I feel like as a Hindu or a practitioner, you have to kind of think these through. And then you have the other extreme, I mean, it's not extreme, but a scholar practitioner who really believes in what they're doing in the practice of Hinduism and their particular tradition, but they also can bring a critical eye to the table. So you get a really good gamut. So I mean, maybe you could speak about like how do you like pick which guests you want on, and how do you engage in trying to get that full like coverage for the listeners?
It's fascinating that I'm on a podcast being interviewed about a podcast. It's so meta. It's great.
Yeah.
And I've actually had whenever I come across a podcast that I think is really rich or a platform, yogic studies, embodied philosophy, of course, the OCHS, I want to share it with people. And so I have them on my podcast. I should probably have you on my podcast, actually. That'd be fascinating. But the tables are turned for now, so I won't defer. I won't deflect. I must do my duty and battle as you request. The podcast that I do is primarily in the space between. Space between is very powerful. Between Shiva and Shakti, there's great power. Between night and day, twilight, dawn and dusk, there's tremendous power in bridging. And I live on a bridge. I'm not a troll. I don't live under a bridge. I live on the bridge. I live in bridging. And so the podcast is called New Books in Indian Religions.
Right.
And it's part of a consortium of podcasts on the New Books Network. For example, new books in English, new books in history, new books in philosophy, sociology, American studies, etc., 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 Russian studies. The mandate of that platform is public education, sharing insights with the public. And so it's a great fit because that's my mission. My mission is one of education, of sharing what there is to share. And so my function is to survey various whatever's coming out in Hindu studies from reputable presses, right? That's not ideological or fanciful.
Sure.
And I invite the author on, ask them some purposely naive questions to launch some. Sometimes I wonder why anyone listens to it because they're so naive. Like, what's your book about?
Right.
Oh, what is Hinduism? But curate some conversation so as what to focus on their text. So for me, it's not a question of whether I agree with their methodology, whether I agree with their conclusions, whether I agree with their faction or this or that. Let's focus on what they're trying to show in their work. It's like, oh, Indraya Namaha, we're going to worship Indra now. Okay, Indra's gone. Okay, Somaya Namaha, we're going to worship Soma now. We're focusing on that work and the merits of that work so people can know it's out there. And it's a neutral space. I don't take sides. Everyone in the Hindu studies world is welcome on that podcast. We've even had Bibek DeBroy on it. We've even had some narrative writers. It really, for me, inclusion is very important. And for inclusion to take place, there has to be a safe space for conversation, the holding of space for various views. That's how I see it.
So I totally agree with that, right? So, but I also find a little bit of like tension here as anything to do with Hinduism, right? There's always this tension that exists, which is, so I thought was interesting when it went from new books in Hindu studies to new books in Indian religions, right?
Oh, yes, that rebrand that rebrand happened since our first interview was at the beginning of 2021. This interview, you are framing my year, really. You're the frame narrative of my year, and we're ending now with your podcast. That's great. So no, it was Hindu studies at the inception, which I inherited,
right?
And I decided to facilitate a rebrand to Indian religion.
Right. So let me ask you about this, and some of this might be a little bit of a pushback, just because like what I find is also like there is, especially in academia, this sense of where Hinduism doesn't exist outside of Indian religion. Like there's no department of Hindu studies. There's departments of like Indian studies,
religious studies,
or religious studies, or South Asian religions, right? But there would be a department of Christian theology. There would be a department that's connected to like Middle Eastern, but that's all pretty much Islamic. So my concern is not a concern, but is the question is why is it always, or not always, but a lot of times, like Hinduism doesn't get its own like space? Why is it always in a larger space?
The way I view that is by understanding that comparing quote unquote the religion of Hinduism with quote unquote other religions is comparing apples and oranges or apples and mangoes, really.
Yeah.
It is sort of a function of the mind to think of it as a thing because of this term that was coined through colonial rule that has to do with this word Hindu or Sindhu or those people across the Indus. The term itself is a catch basin for everything happening over there that we don't quite understand. It's a catch umbrella. It's a civilization. It's an ecosystem of ideas, disparate ideas, right? And so this is important to understand that Hinduism is an umbrella term for a variety of practices and beliefs. So part of, in the case of the podcast, part of the rebrand to Indian religions, and I must note, and I say this sometimes in speech and in writing, when I say Indian, I mean far more than the modern nation state. For example, there's Israel, the modern nation state, and there's Israel, the covenant with Yahweh. There's Israel, the people. A great example is Egypt. I mean, the modern nation state of Egypt is very different than when we say civilization of Egypt, or Persia versus Iran. So Indian, South Asian, to use a technical term, is all that was churning between the Himalayas, between Meru and the ocean. And so Indian religions has to do with religions that hail from that context. There's also a thriving, or maybe not so thriving, but there is a Buddhism channel that I'm not involved in. But on this channel, there's now space for Sikhism studies or Jainism studies, and space for issues where we see Islam and Christianity in Bharata.
But so, and this is where we end up having like this really, I think, difficulty in taxonomy here, right? Because ultimately, like if we're saying Hinduism is this broad coverage of all traditions and things that developed within the Himalayas, Meru to the ocean, then the differentiation of Buddhism and Jainism and Sikhism is also very much like there's that tension, right? Like, is it all
Exactly. And
Hinduism or is it
so
not?
that's why it's quite useful to think of them as dharmic traditions, like the Dharma
Yeah.
Academy of North America, to think of them as united in a samsaric worldview. It's
Right.
an ideological ecosystem that in many ways is a structural opposite of the Abrahamic ecosystem.
Right. Right.
So it's quite useful to think of them in that way.
No, but I will say this. I mean, despite my questioning here, I do enjoy the podcast you have with like when you bring Christians on to, I mean, not Christians, but scholars of Christianity in India, and to talk about even like issues with modern issues with like Christianity in India and the tensions between the Hindu communities and Christian communities, missionary work, because I think those are all important things. I'm just really trying to have a, just kind of pull these threads to have a sense of
absolutely. I welcome conversation. I welcome conversation. Irrespective of whether we agree or disagree, respectful engagement with somebody who's intelligent and caring or both. What else do we need? For me, I'm either a hopeless romantic or incorrigibly idealistic or 5 centuries ahead of my time.
Yeah.
But I think of this thing called humanity, right? What it means to be human and the human experience. And so for me, it's imperative to leave space for whatever group or person is expressing their reality or their concerns without standing in that, if at all possible, holding space for conversation. So I'm the host of the podcast. I'm not the resident Hindu studies scholar or Puranicist or Hindu or Christian or seeker. I'm the host of conversation, right? And so it's incumbent upon me to leave space for all the conversations that matter to the Indic world.
Right. No, and you do that definitely, but it's also, I think it's also worth bearing out that, the idea of just like having that distance, it doesn't exist as much as we want. It's like this, it's that distance is somewhat manufactured, I'd say, like, because when you bring to the table, you bring who you are completely, and that does come with like our biases or ideas.
Yes, the manufacturing that I'm sort of hearing when you speak is this idea that a scholar is detached and sort of robotic and clinical. That I relate to a great deal. There's a person, a set of values and ideology, conscious or unconscious, without question. What I'm saying is when two people are in conversation, I have to be able to listen to what you're saying, not through the lens as much as possible of my ideology.
Sure.
That all I'm saying is taking a step back and holding space for conversation. I don't receive much feedback about the podcast, but when I do, it's positive. It's a bit surreal to speak into a black box and who knows where it goes. And there's tens of thousands of downloads a month, but I don't have a very active social media presence, and the odd note that I get is very favorable. I had one complaint in the history of the podcast after probably near 200 episodes now. A concern, someone who tracked me down and said, look, I quite enjoy your podcast. I heard that episode about Christianity in India, and I think you should take a much more critical lens. Here's some sources for you. Consider this critical theory, consider this and this and this. And for me, I was thinking to myself, does this person think that I'm not capable of critical thinking? Do they think I'm not aware of the scholarship? Do they think this is the space for critical engagement? And then I responded and I said, these are great points. And there are plenty of platforms for critical engagement and then some. This platform is to showcase whoever's on there. And they understood when I said this, my Dharma there is not as a scholar, it's as a host. And as a host, the guest is God, period.
Yeah. No, and that makes sense, and I do appreciate that. So I like I said beginning, I think it's great that you have this entire gamut, because I actually learned a lot. Like, there's gaps. Obviously, we all have gaps in our knowledge, and I have many gaps, and some of these gaps get really filled in with like, at least like, not the gap itself, but like where to look, right? If I'm like, for example, like there was a podcast that I listen to all of them. So I tend to lose track of which ones.
Wow, I'm flattered. That's great. I'm glad you
No,
enjoyed the
because
podcast.
yeah, I'll do it like, when I go to the gym or whatever, or driving the car. Just
Sure.
instead of having like music playing, because I get to listen to something, right? So I actually I do get sources from reading your podcast. I mean, from listening to your podcast, where I'll just go look up the
That's
author.
the hope. Yeah.
Yeah, and then check out like maybe like other thinkers that are thinking in that area that might be along with what the author's saying, and the people that disagree, and then everyone else in the peripheral. So it actually really helps like push listeners towards, even if you have the confirmation bias, you think the guest is 100% right, it leads towards some good work they're doing. And then also, like, if you don't agree, then you get the opposite. Like, I love the work. I wish, to be honest, I wish the podcast with Donald Davis was longer, because I just feel like there's so much. Did you do Donald Davis, or no? Was it Malcolm? You did, right?
No, I did do Donald Davis.
Yeah. So, but I feel like that area of like Hindu studies is so not touched upon. Like, I find it fascinating that the history of like laws and Dharma Shastra, and so I love that podcast. But more like those kind of things are really kind of what I'm drifting towards in some level. So I do appreciate that wide gamut.
Fantastic.
So when you so I think I might have asked, so how like, what do people reach out to you for the podcast, or do you have to go search for them?
So my process is essentially 2 or 3 times a year, I'll take a look at the various go-to publishers in our field, whether it's Routledge, whether it's SUNY, whether it's, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll take a look and see if there are new Hindu studies books. But more often than not, they'll be on my radar because of a listserv, because of a colleague sharing an announcement. Sometimes people will contact me and say, can you cover this book? And I'll just maybe quarterly or so, I'll just send a bunch of invites out, and 99% of the people say yes, sure. Yeah. They might be sheepish, they might be uncomfortable, they may have never done a podcast before, they may not even be quite sure what a podcast is, but there's an audience, and they don't need to be in the audience to actually get their message out to that audience. And so they're very happy typically, and they're very grateful. And I'll email them to ask them, and they'll typically say yes, and I'll say, okay, we'll send a review copy if you can, and they do. And then we set up a time, and then we get on a call like this, and they're unscripted. There are 4 or 5 seminal questions that I tell them I'm going to touch on these, and then we just jam, we just riff, if there's a piece where I find, okay, maybe I could dip into this, it won't lose the audience if I dive into this concept or draw out this broader theme, or at times, more often than not, the author themselves is not aware of why this is important. Or if they are aware of why this is important, they're not conscious of it. They're not really, it's not top of mind for them. I find often, and maybe that's because I'm a big picture thinker, maybe it's a flaw at times, but they're not quite understanding why this is really important. Sometimes they are aware, and sometimes they're not. And I think it's my job to kind of prompt these 30,000 foot view takeaways for people who would just want to have a flyby view of the scholarship, and then they can descend and examine as they see fit. After we have the recording, it's of course edited and posted, and then I typically always inform the author that, okay, the podcast is out, share it whatever you'd like. And being a neophyte on social media, I've started tweeting out, this is my little baby Twitter, this here, check out my interview with this person, and if I can, tag the author or tag the publisher, and that's my little process. And that's an ongoing thing. It's a lifestyle, as you well know. It started off as a favor, it ended up as a lifestyle. That's the white noise of my inbox, is bookings for the podcast, right? In many ways.
So how long does it take you to like do the full process for one podcast? It's like 10 hours from interview, like editing, all that stuff?
Yeah, it varies. I thought you meant how long it takes to book the person. It varies. Sometimes I could have them on within a couple of weeks. Sometimes it takes months. But for me, it's the bookings, it's engaging the work, it's having the conversation.
Yeah.
And then I send the audio off to New Books Network, and they do some minor editing. They're never censored. They're never sliced and diced. There was a pause, or something fell over, or, they have to, or right? The phone rang, but they're never censored. So they take care of the trimming and they post it.
Okay.
And
Have you thought about doing it on video too? Because I think that'd be like, you might be able to reach a larger audience. Not larger necessarily.
yeah,
More
you know
diverse
what?
audience.
It's crossed my mind because I do it on Zooms like you
Yeah.
do,
Yeah.
and the video's typically there. And my God, I've deleted like every time I'm finished, I just delete. Like I've deleted all these video files, and I thought maybe I should post these on YouTube. Maybe somebody might be interested in seeing what these scholars look like. Who knows?
No, but there is something there, right? You get like, instead of just the voice out of the box, it's like this entire like persona, right?
Drishti. You get-
Right. That's right. Which is, I think, is very important. But it is like, I initially, we just started when I first started like 3 years ago. It was really just to do audio, and then I was like, you know what, let's do the video, because I'm like, it's actually good for me also to get face to face.
I just remembered why the thought I had in that moment between emails. When I had that thought, I had another
Yeah.
thought, which is, am I allowed to do that? I mean, I better check with New Books Network. So maybe I'll check with them and ask them, can I post the videos
Yeah.
as well and start a YouTube channel?
Yeah, it's well worth it. You get a lot of people that prefer to watch it than listen.
You know
So-
what? Starting 2021, I'm putting that down. 2021, new year, video. People can actually watch the videos if they want to. That'll be hilarious.
and do
But then,
people
but then I'll have to actually, well, it won't matter. I wear like
Yeah.
a white Gap shirt every day, anyways, as I'm at home. But I may have to shave more often than I like. And
Yeah, it does make me, I think my wife's happy because when I do podcasts, I come out clean because I'm on TV or whatever. And she's like, well, whenever you do podcasts, you don't look like a caveman. I'm like, thanks, I appreciate it.
but either way, I think it'll be befitting the podcast because I'll either look like a Swami or an ascetic.
Which is both.
either way, it's on brand. Perfect.
So I was going to ask, along with, do you guys, when you guys do your podcast and then post it, do people get discounts on books? Is that something that New Books Network is trying to offer? So, because a lot of people will listen and go on if they get like 20% discount or 10% discount.
Yeah, no, it's
some of these
there's
books are like
no
$100 and some dollars.
Sure,
Like-
absolutely. I can't afford my own Routledge books. That's fine. I get it. But no, it's really just about getting the word out there.
Yeah.
The New Books Network doesn't get involved with sort of discounts for different publishers and different titles and all that. Obviously, the publishers often, on and off offer what they're offering.
Right.
But no, it's just about getting the information out there. And if the person is satisfied, they're satisfied. If they're interested in learning more, they'll find it, or they'll borrow it, or they'll buy it. But it's more about education than sort of partnerships or commerce or sales. Yeah. I mean, sales are impacted, I'm sure, to some extent, but the greater impact is hundreds, if not thousands of people are now aware of that author and their work. And they may just, oh, this is interesting, and tune it out. Or they may be like, wow, I've got to follow that person because I've been thinking about this. I'm working in this niche. And so without really trying consciously, some of the feedback I get is that, these are becoming part of book lists. These are becoming part of assignments for students. Mm-hmm. This total integration with the Academy, which I did not foresee at all. This was a public-facing podcast to bring, to kind of, bring down to the ground what's happening at the Ivory Tower. But the scholars themselves are rolling around in the fields and having their picnic. It's very, very, very interesting. And then they go, it's really interesting. There's a panel at the American Academy of Religion from the Hinduism group called New Books in Hindu Studies.
Yeah.
And clearly there's been, some influence from knowledge of the podcast. I mean, this is what scholars do. They look at new books in their fields. Yeah. But that bridging, for me, it was a one-way bridging. That was the intention. But it's really sort of, the membrane is porous both ways because the podcast is really impacting academics in a certain way, which I find fascinating, actually.
So I here's a question, and I don't know if you have an answer to this, but I actually think this is very interesting from my perspective. So like with the work you're doing and the work a lot of other people are doing in terms of like being Moses and bringing the tablets down from on high to the ground.
Prometheus, here's fire, humans.
Yeah, that's right. It's very much like in the vein of the open source kind of like knowledge dissemination of the past, or maybe. But the thing is, we talk about books here. The area of publishing is one of the areas where there's like this crazy to be honest, a monopoly of sorts of control of information dissemination, right? Like in this age of open source, what do you think is the reason why publishers are still being able to command these crazy prices, and why do scholars like yourself, or all the people you interview, decide to still go down the publishing route when there's so many other viable options in disseminating their knowledge? Is there, I mean, so it's just something I was thinking about.
Well, there's a podcast with a colleague named Dominic, who is very much interested in this. We talk about some of these issues on the podcast. Those kinds of answers are well beyond things that I think about. I care about them, but
Yeah.
I don't have nearly enough knowledge of how the field works. My sense is that open access, not open access, I take that back. My sense is that publishing from presses that are not as reputable isn't regarded as safe or as accepted or as vetted typically. So the idea is, like with any brand, right? This is from a press, there's a certain standard, whether that's a myth or whether that's quality control, bona fide quality control. That's my sense. But my sense is that we're, as I say, I'm sort of from the future probably, but my sense is that we're undergoing a huge transformation. In a couple centuries, the presses will be, they won't go the way of the dodo, but they'll be transformed beyond recognition of what we see now. There's no way to hold that back. It's shifting. It really is shifting.
Yeah, I mean, because I can totally see a business model in which a bunch of authors get together, 100 authors, and say you form a collective in which people that buy your books, pay into the collective, and you can hire an editor for there and then publish it on your own, or release the.
Are you trying to give me another project to spearhead? Like, do you want me to organize something else now?
Hey, it's your world, man. It's your world. No, I just find it because I buy a lot of these books, and I'm like, God, this is $120, and I'm like, and these, because they're scholarly, the books, some of them are short, right? There might be like maybe 100, 200 pages, and they're really focused works. And I'm like, that's a lot of money for.
They're for the monographs are done with Routledge. They're what? They're for libraries. They're for specialists. They're for certain subfields within Hindu studies. Someone has to be very nerdy or very much a Raj Balkaran fan to drop that kind of cash on an academic book.
Yeah.
But many people are interested in these ideas. That's different from doing a public book, right? It's a whole different enterprise. It's a different model. They're marketed to people with professorships and research libraries. That's right. So people like you and I, we're kind of in between. We're too, we're too smart for our own good in terms of the kinds of things we want to read, but not smart enough to find a better way to get them without paying all that much money. But it's tricky. It's tricky.
It's tricky, but I also feel like there's so much great knowledge and information in these books that when we don't get it disseminated earlier, it just feels like the general conversation around these ideas is still stuck in the past.
You're in a different place than most listeners. You are someone who brings them that knowledge or connects them with that. So you're in the know, and that's part of your niche or your dharma or what it is you're doing, right? That's important to what you're doing, but that's not for everybody, right? Many people would much prefer or are able to co-lead people like you or myself for what we've figured out by looking at these books.
True. That's a legitimate point. So let's shift a little track here. We talked so much about the podcast and academia world. Let's jump over to, you also, aside from your other 20 different projects, you do the coaching. What about okay, I'm asking so a lot. I have seen there's a lot of coaches out there, who are life coaches, spiritual coaches. What do you think about the tradition or your background gives you the unique perspective to engage in this? Because it's not therapy, but it is kind of, right? At some level, you're not actually doing psychotherapy, but what you are is providing some insight and some maybe at some points oversight and some unique perspectives for the person to consider. So what about like your training, your background has brought that part of it to you?
Right. So coaching, what I call coaching, first of all, to your point, everyone and anyone can be a coach these days. Right? Yeah. And there's a vast array of standards and training and dispositions for coaching. Right?
Sure.
I use the word coaching because there's no better word that I can come up with. Life coaching is the word that I've come up with for something that I've been doing forever, at least
Right.
since I was 12 years old.
Sure.
I remember vividly, even as a teenager, adults would come to me and they would be heard and some advice would issue forth, and it'd be great. That's just
Right.
part of my disposition, the ability to see a person, see where they're at, understand their journey, connect with what they're struggling with, and offer a path out of it or some support out of it. That's just a way of being for me. I've done that my whole life. It wasn't until 2016 that I started charging for it because, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, I was completely broke. I finished my dissertation after many years of training of many kinds, and there were no jobs at all in my field, and so I entrepreneured. Right, I thought, okay, well, let me monetize my mission so I can do it, so I can do what I'm here to do. And so coaching is how someone can sit with me for an hour or whatever, or multiple hours over time, and gain what they need in terms of the rut they're in, or the change you're looking for, the relationship issue, the job issue,
Sure.
the questions about their spiritual practice. So in that particular paradigm, much of it is coming from just my constitution, whether you want to attribute that to genes or upbringing or swabhava or karma. It's something I was born with.
Sure.
In addition to that, I've had many hours, thousands of hours of experience mentoring, coaching, guiding, teaching. So I get people. My real expertise in this world is people. My real, true expertise and passion is people.
Okay.
I did do a coaching certification just in case someone thought, I might need one. I did do some training in coaching. Between that and the humanities degrees and my particular disposition and just having so much experience with people, it's a natural fit. I mean, I wouldn't call myself a therapist, obviously, because I don't have psychological degrees.
Yeah.
And in a way, the paradigm that I use to see people and understand people, it's broader and deeper than psychology allows anyhow. So it's a more holistic view of what a person is, in my view. And so really it's a particular synergy of what I can do for that person. Many a time they'll say, like, wow, we've gone so much further in a month than after 2 years of therapy. Some of them have been to therapy.
Yeah.
It's not something that I know what else to call, but it's something that I do for a person or with a person or empower a person to do in their life. And life coaching is the best word I've come up with, but I'm not sure if there's a better word. Yeah, right. That's I'm being as honest as I can be.
No, absolutely. So how much does, like, your expertise in, Shastras and Puranas and Narratives come into play?
Oh, that's the thing. There's this, it all gets folded in, like, so my years on the planet, my various connections and conversations and experience, they all get folded into the back of my brain on the human experience, insights into the human experience. Mythic texts, insights into the human experience, wisdom text, insights into the human experience, thousands of hours of spiritual training, insights into the human experience, and also the ability to see because your consciousness is more refined with sadhana, obviously. And so really and truly, what I know better than anything else on this planet is not religion, it's not Shastra, it's not spirituality. I know much about that. It's human beings. That is what I know, bar none. How humans work, what drives them, where they're headed, what their pitfalls are. I obviously won't indicate most of that in general conversation because they have to be in a paradigm where they're open to that, to hear what's what. But that's where I'm at.
But no, it strikes me as so, if you look at, like, again, we'll look at Mahabharata, right? Like, anytime
human beings, life wisdom, practical advice. It's the guts of the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. This is the guts of what it means to be in flesh, working our karmas out in this world.
Right. And this is where, like, I find it really interesting, the parallel here, because, like, in the Mahabharata, Yudhishthira has constantly these doubts, and the entire Vanaparva is him lamenting about, like, his situation, and that's where Nala, Damayanti and all these stories come in. But this is really about him, like, coming to a rishi who happens to come by, whether it's Markandeya or whoever, to show up, and he's like, my life sucks, I don't know what to do. It's like a client coming to you. I'm feeling I'm dealing
It's
with
life
this.
coaching. This
Yeah,
is ancient Indian life coaching. That's what's
absolutely.
happening.
And they do it via narrative, right? And this is where I think it's beautiful. It's like, instead of being like, well, you should do this thing or you should do that thing, it's let me
No,
tell you this story about
no, you
how
can't. You
someone lived
can't.
their life.
When coaching someone, you can't give them the answer.
Yeah,
And it's not about the destination, it's about how they get there. So a very powerful
they have to
coach or
get there.
teacher, a very powerful effective coach or teacher, they will be able to see the person or sense them and see where they are, see where they're trying to get, and do what they need to do to facilitate that person getting there.
Right.
Because when they grasp that insight, they'll never forget it. It'll be transformed. You can't unrealize something you realize. You can forget something you've learned. And if
Right.
it's just content, I will bring content or shastra or vignettes, this content as well as consultation, as well as counseling, as well as strategy. But it's not that I know what your problem is. This is what you need to do. And if you don't do this, this will happen. Whereas often it is that case in my brain.
Right.
But that's, I can see where they are. I can see the rut they're in. I can see where they're trying to get. I can see what's wrong with their car. How do I get them to make the changes with their driving or their mirror or their engine to get
Right.
where they need to get? So that's why story is so powerful. Story points you to a truth or a value. Um, uh, I never thought of it that way, but yes, Yudhishthira needs a really good spiritual, like learned life coach or 17 to get.
Al's book is all about that, right?
Yes, but that education is not what we think of as education. That's
right.
Classical humanities, person formation,
That's
pedagogy. Right. That is what's missing in our world.
I 100% agree. So, and the thing, this is why I love, narratives is, like you said, it points to that truth, but in that pointing of the truth in the story, all options are open. So the human being, as they hear that story, they're able to play out the options in their head.
It has to meet you where you're at.
Yeah.
And the story meets you where you're at.
Exactly. And so when you put yourself in the shoes of, say, Nala and dealing with the issue of Damayanti, whatever it is, you suddenly feel yourself making those decisions he made or she made. And then in your life, like, instead of someone saying you shouldn't do that, you're like, well, Nala did this, this, and this, and this is what happened. It's like this open-ended thing, but the end's already there.
The truth is, whether it's the Mahabharata, whether it's Shakespeare, whether it's Lord of the Rings, human experience, our psychic processes, the inner life, this is what these mythic, these larger than life, these narratives are teaching us about what it means to be human and the kinds of issues humans deal with and possible ways to address those issues.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Which is why, I mean, I think, like, people, and what Netflix and stuff does this, they tell stories, but again, I sometimes I feel like the visual domain is very different from the audio domain, right?
Of course.
So it's just the visual domain is, everything's provided to you. There's the ability for kalpana or creativity or imagination doesn't play as much.
What the visual domain? The audio domain is what? It's occurring on Akasha, the most subtle element. Right?
Yeah,
it's the most subtle.
Yeah,
it's most subtle. It's the most conducive to creativity.
Right. So I find it so, like, even so, which is why podcasts are great. Listening to, like, even Arthi Dan's Mahabharata is really nice. It's great to see the visual because it feels come to life. But when you hear it, it's your mind excites. It like opens up and possibilities start, like, really flourishing out. Which is part where I also think, like, the focus on Indian thought for a large part was Vak, right? The power of speech.
Oral traditions, right?
Yeah,
oral
but
traditions.
The speech was so vital.
Without question. Without question, their sound is important, oral transmission is important, mantric recitation, narratives, hearing narratives. The Mahabharata itself is meant to be told, and it tells you that by all the people in the Mahabharata who are told stories. The narrative itself, the stories within stories within stories for teaching. And it's absolutely profound. So for me, that the storytelling brain and the knowledge of Purana, and the studying as I do at the academy and dealing with people, they're all part of what is brought to bear in understanding someone's journey in a coaching session or even just a conversation, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, so are most of your clients, are they Westerners, Indians? Are they? I mean, what kind of background, if you don't mind? I mean, we
No,
don't
I
give
don't.
specific
I don't
information.
mind. No, I don't mind. And it's really interesting that you asked that, because a couple of days ago, I did a talk. It was fascinating. So I interviewed a scholar on the podcast named John Coiney, who is
Okay.
a shared food, shared devotion, that book, and he's a scholar at Michigan State University, and all was well. And then he circled back with an invitation. Would you like to do a public talk? And I thought,
Uh-huh.
like, sure, something along the lines of Hindu spirituality or Indian spirituality. And he was very conscientious and very clear and very conscientious and clear and systematic about stating the concerns that people might have and how problematic the topic is. But he says, we're approaching you because in addition to being, an academic, you're also a life coach.
Yeah.
Here's an academic saying, you're an academic in the field of Hindu studies, and you're also a life coach. Can you do this talk in the spirituality series for us?
Right.
And we got to talking. What he wanted me to do was slightly unheard of for an academic talk. He wanted me to share insights pertaining to the kinds of people that are coming and how they're viewing Indian spirituality, quote unquote.
Right.
And the people that come are of Western origin or they're of Indic origin, but they're typically Westerner in their circumstance. So they're living in the West. They were trained
Right.
or raised in the West. And once upon a time, the coaching didn't really pertain to Shastra spirituality. Now, more and more people are showing up where they have life concerns that are practical, but they also have, for them, samsara is real, karma is real, whether they're in white bodies, whether they're in brown bodies. And they really value interpreting and addressing their issues from within the Indic worldview. So more and more, the boundaries between the coaching and the scholarship and the wisdom teachings, they come together where people show up who are on board with wisdom teachings or Indian
Right.
spirituality or Hindu thought. And that's the lens whereby they deal with their life issues.
So how does that differ from when you interact with like Indian or people of Indian descent, either coaching or engagement with the traditions?
Well, I interact with people of Indian descent all the time. I very rarely, in my circles, probably because I'm in the West, I very rarely interact with someone of Indian descent in India.
Right.
Typically, it's someone of Indian descent, quote unquote, abroad, or maybe
Right.
born in US, UK, Canada, etc. And so, I can only speak to what I know in terms of who comes to me. And I think part of the issue that many folks are having is bridging these paradigms, bridging Indic thought with a Western worldview, particularly a scientific worldview. Many folks have issues of culture and fitting in and mate selection from different cultures if they're from one, or cultural appropriation. Is it okay that I'm a yoga teacher and I love this and I'm a white middle-aged woman, quote unquote? I mean, someone's actually come to me with this question, right? So more and more, the people who are looking for help in their life, whether it's relationships or work, there's always a spiritual or personal piece that they're trying to work out, and I guess that makes sense if they're based on where they're finding me and what context they're finding me. I don't know if I've answered your question, but
well, it was more of, well, the question was more of like how I guess maybe you did answer, because maybe the Indian descent people are no different from the non-Indian descent people in the West, right? And their engagement with these traditions or these ideas, or is there a difference, right? Like
depends on the person, right?
Yeah,
depends.
okay.
It has to. So part of the struggle, the reason why the coaching is very effective is exactly the flip side of why it's difficult to characterize it. It's personalized.
Yeah,
it's responding to that person in that situation and what they're dealing with and their perspective.
right.
So one of the things I joke about at the school or elsewhere, I say, advice is like underwear. It can't be one size fits all. It's too personal. So one individual may have the best of intentions and may really have a draw to Indian spirituality and thought, and they're studying at my school or somewhere else or with a teacher, and they're teaching yoga and they're teaching their students to to register, acknowledge the roots of yoga, and they're pointing them to develop that if they're interested in enrichment in Indian thought. I personally don't see an issue with that. They're not the ones who have to worry about the cultural appropriation. They have to worry about it in terms of in the ways in which we all have to worry about it, but they're actually being responsible and respectful. That's very different from someone who doesn't understand the need, someone who wishes to sanitize and secularize yoga for their situation. Like, these people are in different situations,
Right.
right? A young man who's finished his university, and he's of Indian origin. His parents are Tamil Brahmins, and he's now trying to navigate the ethos at home and the ethos in the business world, and how to bring
Right.
them together. These kinds of situations.
Yeah, I mean, I find, like, you touched upon this, but maybe we talk about this more, is the idea of cultural appropriation. Like, I find myself all over the map on this. I'm not consistent in my ideas around this. Like, I know I get upset when I see abject misuse or commercialization of these Indian or Hindu ideas or concepts, or even, like, I know practices. And then, but I also feel, okay, well, if these things are universal and they're supposed to be practiced by human beings, or in a certain way, won't they naturally change with time and place and situation? And maybe it's not a question of appropriation, but desacredization, and turning it into, like, more of like a commercial, like, the idea of like, it still sits tough with me sometimes, is idea of giving, like, this is why I'm very against things like selling of knowledge, right? I find knowledge to be so pure that it should be freely given. And then I love the idea of dakshina, as you, for what it's value to you give, or whatever it is. And I feel the same goes for a lot of different things that are supposed to be seen as, are treated sacredly, but now we're commercializing it because we as a society think that everything has a value that we can barter for. So I don't know. Am I making sense, or am I just, like, rambling here?
No, you're expressing a variety of perspectives, and what you're doing is you're vocalizing aloud your own conflicted
Yeah.
stance on this very fraught and complex issue. Anyone who has a simple answer for this is not seeing straight. There is no simple answer, because on the one hand, clearly, bastardization of a culture of any kind, commodification, is problematic. Clearly, pretending that yoga developed in a vacuum, and it's like sort of the physical version of mindfulness, and it's sanitized, and
Yeah.
it's corporate wellness. That's the issues with that are numerous, without question.
Right.
Having said that, we need to learn how to be a globe, how to be a people, how to be a species. And we will naturally, as has always been the case, be influenced by other people, be borrowing from other people, be eating the foods of other people, until after a generation or two, they're now our foods. This is going to continue. This has always been the case, and it's exasperated in this age where never before have we had a sort of global consciousness, and the kinds of communication advances we have, the kinds of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The pandemic has taught us nothing. It's that we are a species and we are a globe, whether we like it or not. We need to figure out how to play nice. That doesn't mean that it's willy-nilly and it's a Wild West. But listen, there are people who are drawn to Indian spirituality for their own growth, and then they want to share it, they want to teach it.
Right.
I personally don't see an issue with that whatsoever, both from a humanistic perspective and also from an Indic perspective. If that's that person's karma, they may be more Indian than you are. They happen to be in a brown body in this life.
Yeah.
Who knows? Right? But at the same time, I'll share with you the whole money thing that you touched on, because it's something that's very important to me. That's it was a huge journey that occurred with me, or in me, on this issue. I literally, nothing was working. I literally had 4 cents to my name. If it wasn't for my mother's generous, you know, holidays gift, she went
Yeah.
off to, I don't know what I would have done that December 2015. Rang in the new year, 2016,
Yeah.
with 4 cents to my name. And the only thing that worked for me was entrepreneurship. But I felt like an escort. I felt like, I might as well sell my body. I really, really felt you brought me here for this. After all this intellectual, emotional, spiritual
Yeah. Yeah.
training, this is what you want me to do? To be a businessman? Really? I've never taken a business course in my life, ever. Not even an economics course, believe it or not.
Yeah.
Artsy fartsy guy, clearly, right? Um, and I had this huge journey, huge. It took a lot of inner work. I started off giving away my sessions or
Yeah.
having them pay as you can,
Yeah.
courses pay as you can. For me, I'm just telling you my journey. I've
Yeah.
had this radical transformation regarding money where initially I fell into the trap that our civilization does in thinking of money as matter. Money is gold. Money
Right.
is something to occasion greed, to be hoarded. Money is Shakti,
No, absolutely.
right? And so, no, for my personal journey with it, I now understand being the beneficiary of and engaged in parampara relationships and seeing various exploitative situations on both sides of the guru shishya dynamic. For me, I understand that the 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 currencies of old, the seva, the
Yeah.
bhakti, the respect, we're impoverished. Our culture is impoverished. We don't understand those currencies. We're not capable of those currencies. We're poor. The currency of this climate is money, and money is an expression of energy,
Right.
right? So it's an exchange where, you know you can't give me service, you can't pay my rent, you can't pay my bills, you don't know what I need. This is how you take care of me. This is what I can do for you. And it
Yeah. And
makes it right.
I totally get that. So my issue is not that particular thing, because that particular thing, you're still not treating it as a commodity. You're treating it as a real engagement for which it's valued to you and value to the person that takes it, right? And not a
Yes,
monetary value. It's a value
yes,
of relationship at some level.
yes,
My concern is commodification as we think of it corporately, right? Like in this world where it's just something that you can buy one day and sell the next and get rid of it and throw it around.
yes,
So
yes.
I have no concern with like people giving the knowledge in a relationship, right? Because that's something else. That there's like you said, there's this transfer of energy on both sides. It's this power of play, which that to me is like so I'm on a couple foundations, and one of the foundations is really focused on Kashmir Shaivism, and they want to promote it. And this is a conversation too that we were having a relationship with your students or your disciples, or whatever you want to call it that way. It doesn't lessen because there's money involved here, because money is just a way
Currency.
for us to it's a way
Yeah.
for us to express that relationship,
Yeah.
but it's
To
personal.
exchange, right?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
when we do it as like this is what my issue is, like it's like corporatized, when it's like when like I'll use it like a Deepak Chopra type or whatever, like it becomes something else.
Well, let me put it this way, without speaking about any individual.
You don't have to. I
No, that's fine. I mean, that's fine. What I'm saying is I'm trying to share a principle that
Yeah.
is useful for me with whoever's doing that or view is doing that. People think I don't sleep. I sleep 8 hours every night. Most of my productivity, a lot of it's organization, some of it's drive, and the vast majority of it is that I have the energy available to me that I don't give to things I can't control or change.
Right.
And so the world is full of ignorance. It'll always be full of ignorance.
Correct.
And people will be up to no good in every sphere of life, in every niche. Unless it's my responsibility to police them or control them for a particular reason or engage them, I can only control what I'm doing. And this is what I can do for the world and the people who cross my path. unless you're called, that it's your dharma or you're called to that kind of activism, that's different. But for me, I think let's focus on the things we can control.
Of course. Yeah. No, and I think that's a valid point, and to the extent I was just trying to talk about these issues that I find tumultuous within this space.
It's fraught with nonsense, and it's problematic. It's a complex issue. It really is a complex issue. For me, I end up speaking with very well-intentioned and respectful Westerners who are engaged in Indian spirituality. Nothing in my school's page or message says, come here if you do yoga. But so many of my students do yoga, and they want to honor the roots of yoga, to the point that I got approached to write a book on the myths of behind the asanas. And this is not something I ever saw myself doing. But this is who needs this enrichment, people who really want to honor and deepen their connection. So I'm in that maybe more positive echo chamber, and oftentimes I find myself absolving these people, or they're looking for absolution, probably in the wrong places, but saying, look, I mean, you're being respectful, you're doing what you can, you're becoming part of the change, right?
And so, like, and I do find, so here also I think there's like this idea of cultural appropriation, this concept, it also sits with me, like, at some level, what is happening is a lot of people are saying, if you're not Indian, you can't do X, or if you're not this, you can't do this. And I think that
sounds a little prejudicial, doesn't it?
Well, it sounds idiotic to me. It sounds utterly stupid to me. I feel like you could be white, black, yellow, red, whatever color the universe provides. And if you're practicing a Hindu tradition and you're doing it with Shraddha, Bhakti, with true resolve.
It's Swabhava, right?
Yeah.
Not by the color of the skin, but the content of the character.
That's right. You're right. And I feel like we have this people getting upset all the time, about these cultural appropriation ideas because someone else is wearing it.
Listen, on all sides of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
There are folks who live to be outraged and to facilitate an outrage. So be it. It's not for me. That's not for me. Some yoga, not V-yoga. For me.
Absolutely. I mean, but because I do engage with some of these people, it's I have to make sure my weapons are ready at hand. And by that, I mean my intellectual viveka weapons.
No, for me, it's, look, when I engage with someone and speak to them, and they want to talk to me about a group or someone else, what I find useful is keeping the conversation between us. What's your issue? What can we talk about? But as soon as it shifts to like what a nation is doing or what a corporation is doing, what can we do? Like what are we solving for right now?
Sure. And that problem exists because of a milieu, right? It doesn't exist outside of the milieu. A lot of these existential problems that exist now are obviously due to larger issues that are happening globally. So they're all interconnected, right? At some level. So
without question.
So that conversation does expound to larger points, because it's not just about the particular issues that the individual's having about appropriation, but it might be a larger issue about what is my role in that world? How do I engage with that world that has a entirely different viewpoint, but I'm coming it from here and I don't know how to think differently about this, right? And this is where I think like where a lot of the work the work that you're doing, but also the dialogues people need to have on this, and leeways that people need to give each other to mess up and to fix it, and whatever has to be present, right? But we also have to have some levels of like, okay, we are playing within limits, right? Like, yeah, I get the West in many ways has no respect for things, whether it's drawing Muhammad or putting Ganesha on toilet toilet or like slippers. There's no respect, and like the respect is for freedom of speech. But is that okay? And that I feel like is the conversation also plays a role.
We can't control what others do.
No, 100% true. 100% true. We can't control it.
And by focusing on the nonsense, where does that get us? Unless we can change it. That's different.
Well, again, I come from a perspective where I don't think I can change anything. All I can do is just say things, and things will occur on their own, not due to me, but because of this causal chain of action. But at that point, that thing still has to be done, right? Like change doesn't occur without conversation on change or action on
Here,
it.
I was one of the interviews I did earlier this year was for the BBC. It was a panel on Ganesha for Ganesha Chaturthi.
It was a great one with Lena Headey.
Yes, yes, and it reminds me of something I didn't know existed. I actually attuned the the producers about it because I did some googling. Because I generally find much online discourse and spaces can be a bit toxic. So I didn't know it existed, but there was this charming Australian ad where Ganesha was among the gods of all the ancient world, eating lamb. Yummy. And you might as well have Christ eating dog, right? Like that's how offensive that is. And it's like, okay, well, clearly that needs to be called out. For me, it's like, look, we can't control what others do.
Yeah.
And I think there's so much pain in the Indic world. There's a massive wound that hasn't healed for a couple hundred years. It's part of the zeitgeist. And part of why this is so offensive is because it hurts so much, because we feel personally belittled. How dare you do this to our family and our religion? And no, ahamkara, right? Just if you can, adopt the same teachings you're trying to defend and let it go and rise above.
Yeah, I don't personally, I don't give a crap what people do.
No. I mean, in terms of like the general zeitgeist of outrage.
Like, but this is the point. Is like personally, like if you put, because again, I believe in karma. I don't believe that I have any of this control. Like my anger doesn't add to karma. Like if you do these things of having Ganesha on eating lamb or whatever, I'm not upset about it. I think you're an idiot, but I'm right to think so. And then there's karma. It just plays out. I have no role in that game. Like that's between you and the universe, and the universe will work itself out. And the thing is, like for me, ultimately, like this is just. I mean, I like discussing these things. I never care. I don't get offended a lot of things. Like even for me, because I know that if I believe, and I do truly believe in this entire worldview that we come from in the Hindu sense, then if I believe in that, then my anger does nothing, right? Like we each have our journeys, we each have our paths, we each have our own karmas to have played out and to have to play. And so because of that, like I don't feel this need to like defend gods. I don't feel the need to defend ideas. I would love people to learn the actual idea. That's get the knowledge out. That's more my concern than getting to combat ignorance. But I don't care what people do at the end of the day, right? Because this is action. And ultimately action is all what Hinduism is fundamentally about, right? I don't know, my little rant.
Oh, it makes sense. I mean, there's a reason why we're having this conversation, because you're a sensible interlocutor. You're not here to push buttons or have buttons pushed. You're here to have honest, open conversation about these important issues, without question. I mean, this is why we have podcasts, isn't it?
So on that note, how do you? So I think we discussed last time this idea of timeless truths and it's like engagement in our world today. So how would you talk about these timeless truths? And for example, like what would you use as a timeless truth that maybe our traditions have spoken about, and then like how do we bring it to play in our world today?
Oh, there's so many, so many. There's so many. There's so much wisdom. The school that I founded is called the School of Indian Wisdom for this reason. It's more than religion. It's more than philosophy. It's wisdom. Yeah. There's so much applicable insight about how to live a human life in so many of the Puranas, in so many of the epic. Like you'd have to narrow the question. There's just so much.
Yeah. So, I mean,
I'll give you an example or a situation that may help.
Yeah. Oh, if I can try to think one right now. So, like, let's say a timeless truth. let's use the idea of let's talk about everyone talks about dharma. Let's talk about ahimsa for a second. Okay, what is the concept of non-violence or anirshamshaya, right? Like the concept of non-cruelty in a world like we live today, where everything is based upon some sort of exploitation. How do we engage with these ideas of ahimsa or non-cruelty in today's world?
Well, that'll depend on the person and the situation and their challenge.
See, this is why it's always tough to have conversations with people that know dharma in some sense. I have a sense because dharma is context, right? And so I have to give you, there's not this general universal law, don't do X. It's like,
no,
well,
there are. Let me share this distinction that might be useful for the listeners, because you're probably far too wise for anything I have to say, anyways. But the listeners might.
I'm an idiot.
You know, there. So there is this ideology, this mentality of rules. Don't kill, don't steal, or this thou shalt not. Rules are different from principles.
Okay.
Principles can be held and applied in different situations. So it's not about do this, don't do this. Dharma is subtle. That's why the Yudhishthira is scratching his head at every turn. That's why Arjuna is beside himself. The rule, do this, don't do this, but you say to do this, but the rule says that. The principle has to be applied to the situation. And this requires an openness in the mind. And it requires seeing the situation for what it is. So the spirit of ahimsa is something that we embody day in and day out. Those of us who aren't serial killers.
Right. But then how do people engage with the idea of, well, meat eating versus not meat eating versus, there's this, in many ways, in many Vaishnavite communities, and I belong to that, it's like meat eating is like a super sin, right? Mahapapa or something like that. But other communities, like, you don't, but like, I also look around the world, we have our, most of our equipment in this world is made from some animal product.
Meat eating is, ahimsa is important. Meat eating is important for a lot of Hindus, a lot of vegans, a lot of many people. This is an issue. For me, consciousness is much more than, for me personally, Indian wisdom traditions is geared towards the ascension of consciousness, the purification of manas, the perfection of human perfection, lofty goal, but it's geared towards you purifying in some way. There are people who will eat meat but have fairly sattvic consciousness, and there are people who are vegetarian that have fairly tamastic consciousness. So it doesn't map on so readily. If eating meat is the worst thing you're doing with your life is actually pretty good. If that's the greatest harm you're doing is eating meat in your life, then your life is pretty good. Most people are doing much more harm in many other orders of their life.
No, I agree, right? Like, look, there's that physical harm of what I'm eating, but like maybe you treat people terribly and you're.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Right. And so it becomes a dogmatic rule. This is my point. It becomes a rule. Don't eat meat. Eating meat is bad. No, it's not a rule. It's a principle. The principle is do no harm.
Right.
So your mother's in tears because you're an idiot, but you're worried about this. You're worried about this egg becoming a chicken potentially one day.
Yeah.
The principle of ahimsa, whether you're eating the meat or not, are you living for the welfare of other beings, especially your kith and kin? Right. The principle. So that's the degree. It has to be about the principle. It's not going to be about, oh, do this, don't do this. It's too binary. Hinduism, Indic wisdom is not about switches. It's about dials. It's not switches.
It's great analogy.
It's dials.
It's a great analogy, because I think that's right. Right. It can be a little on, a little off. It can be totally on. There's the entire range. It does strike me, because it's like, I don't coach, but I have a lot of people that that come.
I
to me
think you
for-
do coach. I don't think you realize it, but I think you do coach.
But like
I
people come-
strongly suspect that in your karma sharia, I can see coaching going on there. So it's
well, because you can't define it, I will not define it also. So in my engagement with people that come to talk to me about this
people
stuff, they just
listen. I put
Yeah.
it this way: people come thirsty. You've got some water. That's what it is.
yeah, and but like for me, it's like I don't make the water. I just point. I'm like that's where the water is.
Those
books
are the
water.
best, the most profound teachers and coaches in the world are the ones who get their ego out of the way and just transmit God's grace to these people.
Yeah,
The water is not theirs. They're not manufacturing the H2O.
Yeah.
They're dispensing it.
Yeah, and for me, that's exactly how I see it. I'm like, look, I'm not doing anything for you. These are people that thousands of years before me have thought
But-
about this and really.
Mukunda, but at the same time, how can you drink without a vessel?
That's true. That's true.
Especially when you're handcuffed to some ignorance.
That's true. But after you're, but the problem is after you're done with the vessel, you can throw it down and break it. And
No, a smart person respects the vessel and is grateful for the
no,
vessel.
I know.
What
No,
I'm
no,
saying
but-
is the wisdom is timeless. The wisdom that is taught is timeless. It's sanatana. It's Purana. It's ancient and
Yeah.
timeless. But what is it that keeps that wisdom alive, other than the vessels and the conditioning they hold? What could possibly keep the eternal alive, but the temporal, corporeal karmas? This is what we do as wisdom wielders. It's not about us, it's about our ability to point to, embody a teaching, but it's needed, right? A riverbed is needed for the water to flow.
Right. It's exactly like Krishna says, even in chapter 3, when he says, like this wisdom has been lost and is now I'm bringing it back, right? It's timeless. It exists beyond the time. It'll come and go in this world as necessary. And I do think there's a point in this right now, in this crux on the crack of the future, that where this wisdom is absolutely necessary to
Without
engage
question.
with the future, right? Like, how are we going to not only deal with ourselves in a more conflicted world, and not to say the world was less conflicted before, but the interactions are getting more and more deeper conflict.
What's happening, and it's hard to see. It'll take centuries to see. We are forming a globe in a true sense. We are learning to function as a species.
Yeah.
And that's very difficult, because for the tribes of Earth to unite is not a small order, but nothing short of that will avert the climate disaster.
Well, I mean, the climate disaster might still happen, and most of us are dead, and that's okay. And then we'll come back.
Yes, but there are more people than us who are going to be here then. What I'm saying is that for us to tackle the issues we need to tackle, the pandemic, the climate, these are
Sure.
issues that transcend, I think of Indic traditions as very syncretic, as folding in, like Brahmanism is brilliant. Vedic sacrifice, great. That's where's that? Let's Upanishadic ideology. Let's fold that in. That's the crown jewel of Indian philosophy. Puranas. Let's fold that in. Tantra, well, a little arm's length, but let's fold some of that in too. We really like this whole nyasa stuff, and like yoga. Let's fold that in. Folding in. This is what I mean by print. There's something about the Indic world that's very different from switches in Abrahamic ideology. It's about folding in.
No,
And so I think we have to find a platform whereby to fold in different perspectives.
But I also think it's interesting that even when we talk about things like climate change and pandemic, again, this is fundamentally from our ahamkara, right? Like from the perspective of the world will still abide after us. Like this is all about us as a species. It's not really how much we actually
but
care
it's
about
more
other
than that,
animals. I don't
Mukunda.
know.
It's more than that, because the ecosystem is sick.
Yeah.
It's not just us that's sick. The ecosystem's sick.
Yeah, but that's because of us, and
So, but I mean, it's beyond us. I mean, objectively, the ecosystem is sick.
Yeah, but I think this is where this is my particular point is we would not care the ecosystem is sick, but for the fact that we will lose, right?
I think
And this is
most,
where-
but I think there are some just that you're capable of helping someone because you care that person is imperiled. There are those who really care about the planet.
Absolutely. I'm not disagreeing with you. There are some, but I just feel like when we talk as a society or as a world, as humanity, as we're talking to these these people trying to come together, the reason we care is because it's going to actually affect us.
Without question, and our children and
Right.
grandchildren, and it's without question. That's what motivates people. Self-interest.
And to be frank, and this is also is the only reason the West cares now, which they didn't care for 200 years, for a large part, when they were colonizing the world and doing the same thing, is it's affecting them. And this is where I do find where, and this is a little political, but just the sense of,
Well, are we in the West? Are we the West now or no?
Yeah, I am a Westerner, and so it's an indication.
So when you say it's affecting them, it's affecting us, you mean?
Yeah, it's affecting us, right? But absolutely, but I put myself in that group of the West because I am at the benefit of hundreds of millions of people globally that we're working on the backs of, right? And there's a recognition that at this point also is, what are we doing to lessen their burden? And is it just we're lessening the Earth's burden for our purpose? Or are we lessening the burden for other people? And I think this is where the Indic wisdom comes into play, is to think about these issues.
One of the projects that I'm involved in is a project for the International Society for the Red Cross. They are interested in rules of armed conflict from other traditions. They're responsible for international humanitarian laws related to the Geneva Convention.
Sure.
And enforcing them or teaching them at very least. And so it really, it's rather than let's impose just war theory onto, that's been done. I mean, it's how do we enrich this conversation by understanding indigenously Indic views on armed force? Yeah. And so we're looking at Dharma Yuddha and various combat ethics in the Mahabharata, the Artha Shastra. I just actually submitted a report to them a couple of days ago. But one of the points I made in a couple of paragraphs in the conclusion was understanding these rules are important. This gives you a sense of, okay, you in combat, you have to attack somebody. You can't attack somebody who's sleeping or with a poisonous arrow or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right, et cetera. But more than that, it's not about these are the rules to follow. One has to understand it's a spirit of compassion and ahimsa that is to be adopted by the person, by the warrior. The warrior is one who should be transformed in some sense by this wisdom and go about in the world not, it's my job to care and protect. That's what I'm going to do. It's a spontaneous emanation of your care. So and to care about the world, to care about other organisms, to care whether it affects me or not. This is the cultivation of compassion.
I totally agree with you. And it just is a random thought that pops up. It's totally tangential, but I feel like when you read a Hindu text, when it lists out all the but if not this, 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 but if not, it's this really exhaustive way of saying, don't look at the minutia here, even though we're giving you the minutia, is for you to think about. It's
not about the rules, it's about the principle. Right. It's not about the letter of the law, it's about the spirit of the law. It's not about go read some Shastra by yourself and come back wise and learned. It's about study with someone, be transformed, change your being. Right. So that you can understand the Shastra. The Shastra can't be understood unless you're transforming your awareness alongside what you're trying to learn. You see, the rules are not like if this, if then that, if this, then that, do this, 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 and this, and put a bow on it. No, the rules are just describing what happens naturally, what one is naturally called to do with a certain state of consciousness.
Right. Okay. Do we hit all our topics, or is there anything else that we're missing here? I don't know.
Listen, who knows? I mean, I enjoy speaking with you. I think we're good. I mean, I'm good. I just wanted to chat with you. What comes to mind? Just if people are interested, they know where they can find me, right?
Yeah.
You just put that link up, rajbalkaran.com.
I'm going to put up, your website plus the links to the.
And if there are people out there into yoga, interested in yoga, there's a book that's coming out called The Stories Behind the Poses. It'll be out, I believe, in June 2022. It's already
Okay.
available for pre-order on Amazon. It's 50 poses, and they're the Puranas, or the stories that are related to what the pose is trying to facilitate. I think that might be of interest to some people.
So, I mean, I don't want to ask you too much about it because I know people should read it. But
No,
so
that's
how does
fine.
that?
I don't mind. I don't mind.
Okay, so how does that connect to, like, this?
It's all about sharing knowledge, right? I don't
Yeah, yeah.
mind. Just-
So I mean, this idea that was recently put out, like a few years ago, was it Mark? I forget, Mark Singleton, who talked about how most of these asanas were developed in the past, whatever, like 100 years through interaction with the Swedish gymnasts kind of worldview. So your 50 asanas you cover, is this kind of a rebuttal to that, or is it kind of more of like
it's not firstly, it's not an academic book. What it is, it's a book that it's an illustrated book.
uh-huh
For each of 50 asanas, there's an illustration of the asana and a story pertaining to the asana. In some cases, that's very, very instinctive, like Bhairavasana is related to Bhairava, a wrathful form of Shiva. Vishwamitrasana is related to the sage Vishwamitra. So I'll tell the story of the sage, but I'll tell why the features of the story, the themes of the story, are directly relevant to the consciousness of the pose.
I see.
Right.
Okay.
And so why are these poses named after mythic junctures, after sages, after Devatas?
Yeah.
Why is that the case? Clearly, it's very important for what you are striving after in the pose. You see, that's the sort of premise of the book. I mean, some of it's maybe fun because the stories are narrated, they're retold in an interesting way. But then towards the end of each story, there's sort of the spiritual insight, the mythological wisdom of that story, what it's trying to teach you about life. Parvatasana. For Parvatasana, there's lots of stories about mountains. I mean, you're the local Mount Meru representative, the pillar of the world. But
Yeah.
Parvatasana is what? What story to tell? Well, there's lots of mountain poses. I tell a story of Shiva.
Yeah.
I tell the story of Shiva receiving Ganga on his head. How grounded do you have to be to break the descent of the Ganges falling from heaven to earth? This is Parvatasana. The story is related. It may not be obvious. It may not be a traditional story told for that pose, or it may be. Right. So it gives you insight into the world view so you can understand what whether the asanas are new or not is beside the point. Consciousness is not new, and human beings aren't new.
Right.
Right. It's a question of what element of consciousness and awareness and experience is being cultivated.
Right.
Through the story or through the pose.
Okay. That makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, good. And I did that without arguing with academics. Look at that.
No, I'm looking forward to that. I think that'll be like a really good it's a non-academic book, so it's a great book to share with like my yogi friends.
Exactly. Or even and it's meant to be, speaking of your love of sound, it's meant to be read out loud. It's written in a way that's sort of hopefully poetic and sort of it's
you're
about
gonna do an audiobook with that, aren't you?
I guess I have to at some point. Someone asked me already if I don't know how that works. You'll have to teach me about these things. I'm a neophyte with this.
I don't know how audiobook works. I just think you should have someone like, I don't know, Keith David or a solid like Ian McKellen or something to narrate this, right? It would be fantastic.
Well, if anybody knows them, by all means, send them. RajBalkaran.com. Okay, send them to me.
So it was great talking to you again, Raj. I really appreciate your time. I know you've got so much going on, and I really enjoy it. We cover a lot of different interesting things, and I feel like it's a good synergy. I would definitely want to bring you back on. Maybe I'm thinking down the line we can have like 2 or 3 other guests. We could do like a round robin kind of thing.
That would be cool. Conversation, right?
Yeah.
Conversation. No, I very much appreciate the conversation with you, and all the more that others can listen in on it now that we're recording it and sharing it. But it's where it's at for me. exchanging ideas, exchanging perspectives, learning, growing. Right. So it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure, and I would hop back on anytime.
Absolutely. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Balkaran, Raj, for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Meru Media.
Pushpa Sugandha Sumalaya Samire Pavana Munijana Yamuna Tire Pavana Munijana Yamuna Tire Gayati Vanamali Gayati Vanamali Maduram